seems like a pretty big guy.
He,
He's like, he is in his mind. He's very big.
Yeah. Oh, there's no reaching the limits with that. And here's the thing is like, good.
Glad y'all had fun at my expense.
Right. And he was messing with me last night because we were talking about like my bookstore, and he's one of the only one that was pressing the idea of me doing this full time before, like back when I was a technology director. And I told him, I was like, yeah, I don't know if you realize, but like you would say that, and I would just mentally kind of think to myself, and fuck you, man. We got our doctorate together, and you want me to like just throw all that away, like. This is a podcast. We're talking about books, and we have a guest on. And I know JR. Chuck knows JR. We all went through a doctoral program together. However, this isn't about our educational doctorate. This is more about the reading world. And we don't have him on because he's a superintendent, but that doesn't mean that that's not relevant to who he is and how he is with books. But with no further ado, let's get into it and let's talk to JR about what his experience is and thoughts are on everything we've talked about.
First of all, thank you guys for an opportunity to be on the podcast. Brooks introduced me, JR Proctor. I live in Waco, Texas, and I actually I do know Joanna Gaines. I don't know. I say I know her. I knew her when she was 16. She and I worked at the same place for a little while. So that's an interesting story. That's what everyone, when they hear I'm from Waco, that's what they want to know about.
I don't know who that is.
Fixer Upper.
Chip and Joanna Gaines.
What?
Magnolia. What's their company called?
Yeah. Magnolia Farms.
Magnolia Farms. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. When I hear you're from Waco, that's not what I think about.
No, you think about David Koresh.
David Koresh.
Actually, no, but yeah, it's true.
What's interesting about that is that I'm the superintendent of Axtell ISD, and the Koresh compound, the students that were in the compound that attended public school came to Axtell ISD, and that was a riveting journey for myself when I got here to go through not just the time where it was where the FBI breach and all the controversy that goes with that, but people that are in the school. My secretary, for instance, had tanks in her front yard. She lives just down the street from where the compound is. But hearing the stories of the children that went to school, and a lot of my current teachers were students at the time. We like a lot of small towns, a lot of our teachers have come back to teach, and to hear stories about their friends that were in the compound when it burned down. It's truly been a heartbreaking, eye-opening experience for someone that just witnessed this from the outside, as almost everyone in the world did. To get that insider's perspective on that has definitely shaped Axtell ISD and in turn shaped me and my just compassion for people of different faith, but also people that you would paint with a broad brush. These were friends. These were good people and kids, innocent kids that hadn't made the decision to go the path that some of the adults did. And so as an educator, just to treat all children with grace, regardless of the circumstances or beliefs that their parents or guardians bring to the table. It was pretty humbling experience to hear that. In fact, something very interesting is a Swedish group I was in my office and I was working, and I got a phone call and someone said, "Dr. Proctor, there's someone outside with a camera." And I was like, "Okay," and they're videoing the school. So I go out, and there's this man, probably in his mid 60s, and he's standing there with this pair of young ladies who have a camera and a microphone, and they're talking to him. And so I go over and introduced myself and said, "Hey guys, hey, what's going on? Superintendent of a school. It's not typical to have someone out, shooting video." And they said, "We're a Swedish production company. We're doing a documentary on this gentleman, and his name escapes me right now. It's been about 7 years. But if you recall the footage, there's someone that crawls out onto the roof and jumps off and escapes the fire. It's him, but his two daughters were unable to escape, and they died in the fire. And so I said, "Well, y'all want to come in? I'll search the records and see if we can find anything." And man, I was able to find the daughters, both of their academic records, and it had drawings from them. It had, some coloring things and things that they'd written. And I'm sitting there bawling. I'm getting emotional just thinking about it now. As this man who had never thought that the school would potentially be an avenue to see some of those things. He's crying, and I'm crying, and the videographer is crying. It was a crazy experience. What does that have to do with reading? To me, that was a documentary that was taking a snapshot of someone's soul over the course of a lifetime that had been affected by this worldwide event. And I think that, listening to Chuck talk about Whitman, talking about, leaves of grass and finding meaning in the mundane. I think that all writing, all books show a tiny picture, that 1 square inch of the elephant, that when you pull back is just part of the human experience. And so that, to me, that's what reading is just getting a glimpse of a small picture of humanity through a very particular and small lens. And so talking about that experience of who I am and a little background about what Axtell is, and it's a lot more than that. It's not just, a community in mourning that's been a long time, but that's a piece of who we are. Those experiences are pieces of who we are. And I think books convey, and so a book collection is really a collection, not of, I'm looking at Brooks's collection behind him, and I've had a lot of inside knowledge or inside experience on all the things that go into collecting, what makes things special, what large groups of people find special, what resonates with large groups of people and also individuals. But all of those collections we keep in our hearts and our minds, and that's who we are. And so every book that I've ever read is a piece of who I am.
Well put. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to go ahead and ask a couple of things about what you just said, because frankly, some of that was new to me. I had no idea that the people from the Koresh compound ended up in Axtell. And I'm having a hard time joking about it, which is unfortunate. The reality is that you make a great point of the snapshot of books and all that. But I think more importantly, what I want to say is that what you have to say right now doesn't have to be strictly or at all about books, because I hopefully speak for Chuck about this too, is that, just sharing simply lived experience period gives a window into who you are. And that's what kind of the most important part of this kind of thing is. And when it comes to, there was something regarding, I was going to ask if the kids, you said the kids that were at the compound ended up at Axtell. I'm guessing, they were all different ages, but for some of them, or most of them, they'd be about my age, your age now, right? Do they still live in the community?
No. So age-wise, they would be the kiddos that were at the elementary, and that's where all the kiddos were. Where I believe they'd be in their mid-30s at this point.
Yeah,
and I'm just going on what the teachers that I have that went to school with these kiddos, and the principal at the time. I will tell you a couple of things on the background of that. Those kiddos were in and out of school pretty often. They came to school, obviously had been neglected. They weren't clean. They were malnourished. Living conditions were really, really bad, and they got worse and worse and worse, especially as things began to unfold. And so it was really a contentious relationship with the adults because of the welfare of the children and trying to take care of those children. And so they would withdraw those students and bring them in in a homeschool setting. And then, after a time, they would put them back in public school. And this went on for years. And then they took all those kiddos out of school as things kind of reached the really intense time when investigations of weapons and mistreatment and things of that nature were going on. And so the overwhelming majority of those kids died in the fire.
I'm just follow up that, have you had any interactions with any of these kids? I guess they're age 30, mid-30s kind of now. I mean,
none that were in there, no. Only their friends that are teachers of mine now.
Okay. So I was thinking that it'd be good to just go ahead and tell us how you currently consume books and go down the path of why that is, and why you enjoy it that way, or why it's necessitated.
Well, let me tell you this. First of all, I want to talk about the name of your podcast, Reading Under the Influence, which I think is interesting because the way the brain works, and Chuck will probably talk about the actual Greek roots of what I'm talking about, is as you bring in to your mind through reading, it will influence you. Very little sometimes, very profoundly at other times, depending upon the resonance of the book and its application and timing and all of those things. But and so I think it's important for me understanding that what I choose to read will have an influence on myself. And that doesn't mean that I'm very, very strict about what I read, but just knowing that to me, creativity is directly tied to exposure to ideas. And so as a leader, as an educational leader, I think it would be very foolish and myopic to enter into an echo chamber where I'm just reading about school district leadership from school district leaders. And so I do read a lot of nonfiction, lots of science journal reading, not, pre-pandemic. But I'm also, a lot of times as superintendent, I'm looked at from people, they'll call and say, what are your thoughts on this scientific phenomenon? And so I'm constantly researching when whether we're talking about quantum computing, whether we're talking about Bitcoin or blockchain technology, whether we're talking about coding, whether we're talking about, I get lots of questions about the nature of vaccination. Why is it important? Why should we be doing it? What are these, counterpoints that I'm hearing about it? And so to me, reading is not just about leadership in an educational setting. It is all the things that I am responsible for providing resources. And almost on a daily basis, I'll get a phone call and for input on how should I treat this medical situation, or how should I treat this dilemma I'm having with my child who's trying to progress through a tough stage in life. And so in order for, how do I recharge my batteries? And we've talked a little bit about that in the past, battery, as a metaphor for our body, our emotional balance, as you will, or energy level. The way I charge my batteries is listening to good books, reading lots of articles, probably 10 or 12 different articles a day, when things allow me to do so. And then, keeping up with the Cowboys or the Dallas Mavericks, so I do lots and lots of reading.
The three of us were in a class, a couple of classes together, where we were introduced to this project called a Poetic of Leadership, where we had to draw from popular culture a novel, a poem, and a movie. Do you find metaphors for your leadership style, or your what you do from fiction, as much as you mentioned reading nonfiction? Do you catch yourself trying to, when you read, say, your general fiction novel, whatever you're liking?
Yeah, whatever that is.
Yeah, whatever that might be. Exactly. Which we may be interested in asking you that. So hold on to that thought. But do you see in reading fiction these metaphors of leadership, of interacting with others, glimpses into that humanity that the book itself kind of represents? And what does that mean for you?
Absolutely. I think that each book, a character, a lot of times, maybe even most of the time, maybe not all the time, but maybe most of the time, someone in that book will emerge as the leader. And I think that the author will portray ideals upon that through their lens. And so when you are reading about a leader in a book, you are seeing an idealistic view of what a leader is through that author's lens. And so as you, and I've probably consumed, not an exaggeration, hundreds of books, maybe thousands, honestly. Each one of those gives you a little bit of a piece of leadership, thought processes, lenses to examine a situation through. And so absolutely, I think that you, through fiction, you're reading about idealistic characters, idealistically bad, idealistically good. And so you know, a book that has resonated with me my whole life since I've read it was Ender's Game, and watching him emerge as a leader. And there's a parallel novel to that Orson Scott Card wrote, called Ender's Shadow, and it's about a character that is key to the first book, Ender's Game, but it's the whole story told through his perspective rather than through Ender, which is Andrew Wiggin, through his lens, and you get to see the flaws of his thought processes and then examine through a different perspective. So, to make it an easy connection for myself, watching his leadership develop and is just one of 1,000 cases that whether through movies or books or any other media that's about storytelling, it will influence your leadership. And I think there's a lot to gain from seeing those idealistic images of leadership through these very bright and exceptionally creative writers and thinkers. It's good to see what they think great leadership is.
We're in a fantasy football league called Battle School. It's built
That's
around,
right.
the battle school that's in Ender's Game. And so that kind of illustrates particularly your passion for that book, but you turned me onto it, and, Ender's Game is amazing, but, and I hate to step away completely from leadership, but I don't fully feel like I am, because, leadership is not just, I am the leader, I am telling things I have decided are good. It is so much more complicated than that. And the relationships are just like they are in the classroom, crucial. And so the I don't know, when you talk about Bean, who is the character you're talking about from Ender's Shadow, he's a part of it, and or part of Ender's Game, and I feel like you're right. He's integral. However, I don't think that's the first person somebody who read Ender's Game would think, well, I want to hear it from that perspective. But it really might be one of the best, because his growth as a child, living on the streets and that kind of thing, really defined who he was. But it's almost like Ender transcended how he was going to be viewed in my mind by Bean. And so, it's interesting for me to think about if you took the Enderverse and threw it out to everybody, who everybody would really be able to relate to the most. Because while I think everybody wants to watch Superman and be like, well, I would be Superman. The reality is that based on the story, we find ourselves going from the protagonist to the antagonist, or somewhere anywhere in the middle. And everybody from Ender to Bean to, that guy that ended up bullying him and getting killed in battle school.
Achilles, or Achilles, Achilles.
Right, right. Yeah. The fact that he was that way, he wasn't born that way. And telling the story might offer some context, not to say, oh, this was great behavior by this guy, but to explain it, because the judging a book by its cover comes in with people too, in a moment.
Absolutely.
So, let me ask you this. I'm glad you said Ender's Game, and that leads me to ask you about your Pogo Broccolini, which would be the holy grail of any book that you could collect. And when we first started doing this, or I started doing this, and we're going to talk about Easton Press, there was this signed edition of Ender's Game out there that
I've got it.
for both of us was like, wow, that's really expensive. And now it's kind of like, okay, that's not expensive compared to a lot of other things that are out there. In fact, something I mentioned was the Ender's Game that you can get from Easton Press can be purchased for a little over $100, which is kind of amazing for a nice leather bound edition. You've got it. It's great. But Centipede Press made an edition that's $1,600. And I don't know if you look at it on its face and go, like, if you were to ask, if you put them side by side for somebody that wasn't versed and experienced with, what valuation was, say, which one of these do you think costs $100, and which one of these can you buy right now for $200, and which one of these would it cost you $1,600 to buy? And you don't get that from the first look. You have to go deeper into just how limited the Centipede Press version is, and the artwork, and just how ubiquitous the Easton Press one is, because there's the first printing that you can actually, with them, which you rarely can, differentiate from the later ones because they changed what was on the spine. But that Ender's Game is a great cover too, and looks nice, and is I think part of the appeal of owning it. But I don't know if that's why you wanted it, because we weren't aware of any other ones. It was a matter of having a signed edition. If I'm not.
Yeah, and mine is, I have a signed edition.
Yeah. So do this for us. And Ender's Game can be part of this conversation, but really what it comes down to is what that you don't have would you want to have if you had top 3 collectible items, and they don't even have to exist yet. If they do,
yeah. This is cheating a little bit because I think you and I talked about this recently. A signed copy of The Lord of the Flies. That's a book that resonated with me, and there were a lot of books that you read in literature in high school that, frankly, you're like, wow, I could have gone an entire lifetime without reading that, and been fine. And I won't name all those books because I know they're treasures to a lot of people. But Lord of the Flies was a haunting tale for me, and as a kid, that had been in so many diverse social circumstances growing up. Seeing the outsiders, seeing the strong, seeing the manipulation, seeing the death, and the realization of shame at the end, and personally having to reconcile that at different times in my life, perhaps I had been in each one of those camps. That was one of the first books that I read that really I had a lot of introspection about, that I could relate to. I mean, I was not able to relate to the Grapes of Wrath. I'd never been on a trail out to California traveling through the Dust Bowl. I couldn't relate to it. But that book, Lord of the Flies, really resonated with me. So that's one that is probably right up there with a book that if William Golding had signed it, I would display with pride.
So,
well, I mean,
so what we've heard is it would be great to have a signed edition of Lord of the Flies. What else?
I would love to have a signed set of everything Dresden Files also.
I had that. You could have bought it. It's been sold.
Yeah, there was a reason I didn't buy it.
Right. Yeah, no, hey, that's something we have already talked about and will continue to talk about, is that, every collector has their reasonable price line on things. And especially book 1 of that runs $250, $300 if you're lucky for a really good condition one. So let alone have
And
all
it's
of
one
them.
of 15,
Yeah.
one of 15 books.
Although, you know, that there's a publisher called Grim Oaks Press that is newly starting over the Dresden Files with Stormfront and doing signed limited editions, which is pretty exciting. And they're going to do at least 4 or 5, I believe. I'm sure at least 5. And, you know, Subterranean Press has done theirs. And, you know, I've got my opinion about Subterranean Press of, you know, it all just kind of seems to be the same. But this one is, if you want to get on the ground floor, it's pretty easy when you do it at the beginning.
Yeah, I'm interested.
Obviously. Any other things that you could think of that if you have seen or would really want to, you know, put on? I know you have a display at work of your books. I've seen them. And, you know, like having the Lord of the Rings there and a nice Easton Press set, and having, you know, there's several things there to spark a conversation. Because I think that's really what presentation pieces are for. I mean, they're there for
I feel like for me, those are conversation starters, but also at this point, the printed book is really art for exhibition.
Right.
You know, there's so many different ways to consume, you know, novels now, whether it be on a tablet or through audio. So seeing a book, which is somewhat archaic, you know, print is dead, you know, people talk about that, but it's powerful because of the meaning of a book. It's just become culturally significant because it's an image of information that can be passed on. And you know, it's interesting. I was meeting with a group of gifted and talented students, and so as a superintendent, one of the things that I've set up is for my high school GT students to come to my office, and we will go through, you know, thought experiments, a Socratic method, and we talked about the greatest inventions or discoveries in human history. And one of the students talked about the printing press. So we're talking about a student, you know, 15-year-old student, recognizing the importance of the printing press. And I think it's so embedded in our world that books were the primary means of communicating in-depth, culturally significant ideas. And I think that when people see that, they come into my office, you know, kiddos, very young, go, "Oh wow, what are these books?" And they want to go talk about them. And what is that one about? And well, that one's signed by the author. How old is it? And so it's fascinating, relatable, and at this point, novel. And I don't mean novel like it's a written novel, but the novelty of the written word is it's art. That's basically
good. Like you didn't really give me another example, but you did continue along the mental pathway that I
you know, Frank Herbert, Dune. I would love to have a signed copy of Dune.
Yeah, those are hard to come by. His son continues to write, and you can get his son to have signed stuff. But I've got a signed Dune thing on my list. But that's one book that transcends this problem you run into with a saturation in the market of limited editions of things, where it's like, okay, that's been done before. That's not the way people feel about Dune. I think Dune could be done hundreds of different ways and no one would complain. And
it's about to get big again.
It makes sense because I think a lot of people value Dune for different reasons, or don't value it at all for good reason.
JR, hey, let me ask you this. Would you ever collect a book or acquire a book that isn't a book that like you would want to read or have read, just for the sake of it maybe it has some other meaning other than the aspect of literature or the story or the author or whatever. Is there any kind of book like that you can think of?
Yeah, remembrance of things past. Considered one of the great, works of English literature, or I guess that would be American literature, right? Proust?
Is it Proust?
No, it's not Proust. What?
Proost, right?
Proost.
I thought it was Proust.
Y'all may be right.
Look that up.
This is how I've been.
That's what I'm doing. Proost.
So your computer's wrong.
It is. I will tell Siri that she is wrong in this case.
And so we came up with what I'll call the "Come On Eileen" book. That's really in many ways considered the number one-hit wonder of all time for music. So there's books along those lines too. And just like with Dexy's Midnight Runners, that wasn't the only song they ever recorded. It was just the only one that ever grabbed the people. And so what the question is what book by any author do you feel like is the only book worth reading, or that even you read, but that you're just aware of?
Yeah. That's a big question.
You
for
said
me,
you were ready for
immediately what comes to my mind is Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes.
Yeah.
That book, gut-wrenching, soul just crushing story that could be a metaphor for so many different things in life, so many avenues to examine. I've reflected on that book hundreds of times, and I don't know that Daniel Keyes wrote anything else. I don't know.
Well, I pulled it up while you were saying that because I certainly had nothing else and I loved, at a young age, loved Flowers for Algernon. In fact, I have several different editions here. And so I pulled up to see what else there was. And there are other things I haven't. The Minds of Billy Milligan I'm not sure if you heard of that, but that sounds like you nailed it, at least for my lived experience, for yours. I'm sure there's going to be folks out there going, no, The Minds of Billy Milligan, or The Milligan Wars, or The Touch, The Asylum Prophecies. Those were all great to me too. But I do think that just based on my experience as a collector and buyer of books that other people are going to want, that is one where, it's the only one I've ever seen that's been recreated in ways where there's signed editions and collectible editions and deluxe limited editions, and one that I frankly think deserves like a really nice, cool treatment. It is, like you said, a tough story, and so sometimes it can be difficult when it's not horror to create a presentation that captures that without it being disturbing in the wrong ways. We've jokingly talked about rebinding 11/22/63, the JFK book by Stephen King, and just rebinding it in the skull bones of something. And right. Oh, yeah. Your face says it all. It's just too much. Yeah. It's not even, it's only funny to me. But Flowers of Algernon, that's a great call. I like that. Yeah.
I wanted just the Mannlicher Cravano rifle across the front of it in diagonal with 3 empty shell casings laying next to it.
Yeah, we got pretty dark, and JR is not exactly a dark person, so we'll save our conversation. Actually, you know what? I am going to do a special rebind of that book with first printings and some signed editions. And so we'll talk about the jokes that we had along that on a different episode.
So, but you know what you guys said about Flowers for Algernon, that book, even though there's others out there, and I'm sure there are people out there who are like into that, and know that there are other books. But that's one of the things about this show that I really had a lot of buy-in when we first started talking about this, was the fact that so in a practical term, how many people knew before A Handmaid's Tale how many books Margaret Atwood had written? That 17, 20 novels, poetry books, children's novels, all of that. I mean, she was prolific in a sense. But there's a group of people out there that will only know A Handmaid's Tale because of the way in which it's been publicized through the series, and which is great. I think that's great for literature too. A lot of people may disagree with that, but I think that's great for literature. But having these conversations, because I didn't know either. I didn't know that to me that book was been a one-hit wonder. That's the only reference I've ever heard. Definitely layer of popularity. So, I mean, I think that's part of having these conversations, right? Is to expose others and ourselves to the fact that there may be things out there that are A, worthy of reading, or B, worthy of collecting that we maybe never thought of before.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you draw a parallel to the music industry, you had the A side and the B side. The A side was the hit. And there were a lot of songs that were hit songs that were the B side. And if you do a search, B side hits, I mean, that's a thing. There's a lot of B side.
Well, the B side was usually what the artist wanted to do, that they weren't like the people that were telling them to make the album weren't as interested in. And so it only makes
a lot of times that's right. Yeah.
Ones that came really from the heart and recognized, like you could absolutely search for what songs by artists are they sick of doing, because that's not their favorite song. In fact, what song do you think of with Nirvana? Smells Like Teen Spirit, right? They hated how that actually transpired, because it was exactly the opposite of what their intention was with the song, was to become this like pop success. They were trying to absolutely buck the system, and that's kind of the popularity of all that anyway. But so
I think JR's introduced another concept that we should try to develop for this. B-side books, books that an author wrote that weren't as popular as the one that they're really, or the ones that they're really known for.
Underrated books.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, you know what? We talk about our favorites, and I started episode 1 with Name of the Wind, and I should fully acknowledge that you turned me onto that book and shoved that book down my throat until I read it. And I appreciate it, because I have got a short-term willingness on almost anything because of just how much media gets thrown at me and how much I reach out to grab. And so, you tell me, no, you gotta give this a shot, you gotta go, and sooner or later I hit it. And so, I know that for you, Name of the Wind is one of your favorites as well. And you feel free to go on about that. But I also want to throw in as an alternative, or as an additional question of like the first book that you feel like really captured you that wasn't assigned to you.
As a very young child, I was a voracious reader. And I can remember the feeling I had reading the Hardy Boys. Started reading them at 7 years old. And by the end of second grade, I'd read just about everyone that I had access to. everyone that a store would carry. There were more, but they just weren't, not many stores back in that time. We're talking about 1982, 1981, had the entire selection stocked indefinitely at that time, being a serial set that was written, 20 years prior to that. It just wasn't, there wasn't every copy, every one, but I never was assigned any of that. I read all of those books, and it was an escape for me. It's interesting because none of my friends were readers at that age, and as nerdy as I was, hey, you want to read? You want to borrow one of my Hardy Boys books? Nope. No one was saying, ooh, JR, when you finish with that one, let me have the next. No, there was none of that. Judy Blume, Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing, one of my all-time favorite books.
Love Ramona Quimby.
Old Yeller, I read that these are all books I went to the library and just checked out on my own. And the librarian, she would say things to me. She would say, JR, you're the only one your age that comes in here and checks out books. I was the only one that would go in and check those out that wasn't related to a class project. And honestly, I don't remember how many novels I read in elementary school, and none of them were assigned. But those are some of the ones that pop up in my mind that I really enjoyed. So I hope that answers that question.
Well, it does. Yeah, that reminds me of my own experience of going to the library and taking the Max out every time. And I'm not sure I got Old Yeller during that time period, but the other ones, and I bet you a lot of them are the same, because I don't think the librarian was telling me you're the only kid doing this, but I would go to the library with my mom, and I would in Nacogdoches at the time, the library was downtown where the brick streets are, and that building that it was in had a basement, and that's where all the kids' books were. And I would go down there, and it would be just me. I would just kind of like shift around and find what I needed, and then make my way back upstairs to leave with what I had. And I don't remember a time when any of my friends were like, hey, what's the latest book you want to recommend to me?
Well, yeah, I shared this with Brooks on a little bit. Was that in our first show we may have talked about? I wasn't a reader as a kid, not of books. My mother bought a World Book Encyclopedia set, and I would read articles about everything from the Great Pyramids to figures from the Bible to just you name it, anything, you think of a topic that might be interesting to anyone, and I was reading it, and but it was digestible. It wasn't like committing to a novel and reading it. I didn't have the attention span, I don't think, at that time in my life to really commit to reading anything of any length, even though when you think of encyclopedias being massive volumes, I didn't think of them that way. I thought of them as bite-sized morsels of information. Actually, I think Brooks, that probably goes back to a question he asked me, is like, where did my interest in like Greek and Latin and Hebrew and all that really come from? That's actually where I was first introduced to the Greek alphabet in an encyclopedia. I was probably, I think I said it 11 or 12. I'm pretty sure it was 12. The first time I finished a novel that was a novel, and it was actually a Stephen King novel that my sister introduced me to. And then my mother introduced me to White Fang by Jack London, and I read White Fang, loved it. Still to this day, it's one of my favorite novels. But I didn't have. I mean, my mother loved literature, and she always had books in the house. But I don't think I set foot in a library until I was probably in high school, outside of a school library. That is, going to the library as part of your English class or whatever. But yeah, I was probably 10th or 11th grade before I ever went to the public library and actually got a library card. And so that's an experience that you guys had that I didn't really have that as a kid. It was just kind of like read what you have available. And, my mother would always, remember and I guess they still do it. Do you remember the book companies would send home the little list of books and you would check which ones you wanted? My mother always got me books that way, but didn't get to go to the library and get them. And so to this day, though, I have a really difficult time going and checking a book out of the library and reading it. I'll go to Barnes and Noble and buy it and, and bring it home and read it, but going to the library and checking out books, I've just never really been able to do that. And I don't know why. And it's interesting to hear you talk about that. You guys don't know how I actually romanticized that event as a kid. Stephen King's It, Ben Hanscom is a character who talks about him going to the library and checking out books and reading. And it's like, man, I wish I was that kid. And, to hear you say it, I just didn't have that opportunity. And I think I was a late bloomer when it came to reading books in a sense. And so, I enjoyed that story. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, about every 2 weeks for multiple years, my family would load up and go to the public library, and it would not be uncommon for me to. My brother was not a reader. He was like you were, Chuck. He's a reader now, but he wasn't. For me to bring 6 or 7 books home every 2 weeks, and I didn't read all of them, but I did read a lot of them. But I remember that experience, the smell of the public library. In fact, when we're talking about, books, my favorite place in the world to go, and I haven't been in years now, but when I lived in Dallas, there is a half-price books on Northwest Highway and Highway 75, and it's a used bookstore, and it's the size of a Walmart. And
I've been there with you.
Yeah, I can walk into that place, and if there is any stress in my system, it just vacates the premises. It just leaves. And when my wife and I were what we called married single people, when we were, I guess, newlyweds for 10 years before we had children, when we would go on a date night, we would wind up a lot of times, if we'd go to a movie occasionally, but many times we would go out to eat somewhere, and then we'd go to Half Price Books and sit and read for several hours. How's that for nerd documentary?
Sounds like why you didn't have children.
It's part of the reason. I was also working on education. So, but I mean, I've always said that's my Mecca, that's my pilgrimage, is to that Half Price Books, and just the smell. And I know it sounds crazy, but I would just open the book and smell it. And I think a lot of that started from the hundreds of hours that I spent in the public library growing up. My aunt owned a bookstore when I was a young child. So, when I enter that type of setting, and even Barnes and Noble has that mystique, but there's something about the dusty old novels at a Half Price book where you don't know if there's a book on the shelves that's 100 years old, and some of them are, and just the humbling nature of seeing thousands and thousands and thousands of people's significant works to just humble you. The ideas in that one store are staggering. So I have a love affair with books.
Now's a good time to go ahead and like and subscribe. And if you like our videos, hit that bell so you'll be the first to get our next video.